This is not your grave, but you are welcome in it.
Creation of the domain. 500 million years ago. Before there was the Forerunners, there were the Precursors. The Precursors created the domain and a repository for all knowledge in the universe. The domain is ancient to the Forerunner species and has links to the flood parasite and to the flood gravemind. Birth of the Forerunners. 15 million years ago. The Forerunner race was created by the Precursors in an effort to make a new species that could assume the mantle of responsibility. The Forerunners never lived up to the expectations of the Precursors, determining the Forerunners were a failed experiment and tried to remove all Forerunners from the galaxy, resulting in the Forerunner-Precursor War. Forerunner-Precursor War. 10 million years ago. The Forerunners learned of the Precursors' desire to remove the Forerunner race from existence and decided that the only way they could survive was to destroy the Precursors. Very little is known of this war, with the exception that the Forerunners successfully eliminated the Precursors from both the Milky Way and the large Magellanic Cloud. Following the war, the Forerunners removed all references to the event from their history, completely forgetting it ever happened. The Precursors, meanwhile, did many things to ensure its survival, including converting themselves into desiccated powder and sending that powder into deep space aboard spaceships. This powder was later found by ancient humans and became the catalyst to what would later become the Flood. Construction of Mithrilium. 125,000 BCE. Forerunners built the centerpiece of their civilization, an artificial world that served as the center of all Forerunner governments, Mithrilium. Built as a series of planetary plates connected via a single axle, Mithrilium sported a 100,000 kilometer diameter at its central disk, making the world nearly the size of planet Saturn. Unknown to most Forerunners at the time, or ever, was that the world was constructed around an ancient precursor construct, with strong connections to the domain known as Abaddon. Though very large and functioning as the center of government for the entire Forerunner species, the world was home to only several 100,000 Forerunners who served as part of the government. Birth of the Flood. 107,445 BCE. Ancient humans discovered the abandoned ships containing the powder of precursors that had survived the Precursor-Forerunner War. These ancient humans, for some unknown reason, fed the powder to their pets known as the Feru on the human world of Fan Hakor. Over several generations, the Feru were genetically altered by this powder, turning carnivorous and feral. This genetic mutation eventually spread to the humans on Fan Hakor, and after many generations of mutations, became what would be called the Flood. Human-Forerunner War. After the emergence of the Flood, human civilization was desperate to expand their territory away from the flood-controlled regions of space. As part of this expansion, humans clashed with Forerunner-populated worlds, sparking a war between the two species. Not knowing that humanity was running from a threat to their existence, the Forerunners retaliated fiercely, eventually beating humanity back to only a handful of worlds, including their capital on Sharum Hakor over the next 1,000 years. Discovery of the Primordial. Planet Sharum Hakor. Shortly prior to the end of the Human-Forerunner Wars, ancient humans discovered a precursor stasis chamber containing a creature they called the Primordial. The Primordial, along with the stasis chamber, was taken to Sharum Hakor, where it was interrogated, teaching the humans on the origins of the Flood. Many humans were so horrified by what they had learned from the Primordial they committed suicide. The Primordial remained at Sharum Hakor until its release during the test firing of Halo Ring Installation 07. Battle of Sharum Hakor. Sharum Hakor was the capital of the ancient human civilization and was protected by a large defense force that was able to fend off the might of the Forerunners for decades. Using some of the precursor technology left on the planet, humanity kept the Forerunners from taking the planet until they were eventually betrayed by the Silentium allies. Betrayal of the Silentium. Silentium homeworld, Gendre Quam. The Battle of Gendre Quam was a brief conflict between the Silentium and Forerunners on the quarantined Silentium homeworld. The Silentium, who had been allied with humanity for much of the conflict with the Forerunners, betrayed the alliance in exchange for leniency from the Forerunner Empire. When the Forerunners emerged victorious, they quarantined all of the Silentium to their home system, including Gendre Quam, a much less harsh punishment than the one given to the humans. End of Human-Forerunner War. Though humans were allied with the Silentium for most of the war, the Silentium were eventually convinced to cease their support in return for leniency from the Forerunners. With this betrayal, along with the attrition of a millennia of fighting the Forerunners and Flood, tipped the scales firmly in the Forerunners' favor, securing a defeat for humanity. Despite humanity fighting to the end, they were overrun at the Battle of Sharum Hakor and the final few worlds they still inhabited. By the end of the war, humanity came close to extinction, though due to the Librarian, the Forerunner Council was convinced to spare the race in hopes of developing a cure to the Flood. As a compromise to putting humanity into extinction, the Forerunners devolved them into a lesser, simple being, and were then placed on worlds such as Erde Tyrene, also known as Earth, the Halo Rings, and the Lesser Ark Installation. It was in these locations where humanity was allowed to continue living a pre-industrial life in exchange for the Forerunners studying them for a cure to the Flood parasite. Exile of the Didact. Planet Namdagro and Erde Tyrene. After losing political power to the Master Builder and the entire Builder race following the end of the Human-Forerunner Wars, the Didact placed himself in exile within a Cryptum on Namdagro, which was later moved to Erde Tyrene. While the Didact held significant power within the Forerunner government after his victory against ancient humanity, and used that power to build many shield worlds to defend against the Flood, the Master Builder eventually won the political fight, convincing those in power that the Halo Array was a better and more effective plan. Having lost all political power and facing public shaming, the Didact chose to hide away in a Cryptum until he was needed again. Expedition to Path Chthona. Between the end of the Human-Forerunner War and the political fight that led to the exile of the Didact, Forerunner leadership debated on the right course of action to defend civilizations and the galaxy against the growing Flood parasite threat, should it return. In an attempt to learn more about their origins, the Librarian chartered a mission to Path Chthona, where it was thought the Flood originated. Upon arriving in the galaxy, the Librarian and the rest of the crew discovered a planet inhabited by descendants of ancient Forerunners and what they could only describe as a biological domain, where all their historical knowledge was kept. It was through their interactions with the Forerunner descendants and the biological domain that the Librarian discovered the truth about the Forerunner Precursor War 10 million years prior, and the shame those ancient Forerunners faced after the destruction of their makers. Though the Librarian returned seemingly without knowledge of the Flood's origins, it was only later that she was able to piece together this information with what the Isodidact, also known as Bornstellar, would learn later from the Primordial and determine that the Precursors were the source of the Flood. The Flood returned to the Milky Way galaxy. Planet Seaward. The Flood was first observed at the edges of the galaxy on the planet Seaward, a Forerunner colony world. After loss of contact from several groups on the planet, a military detachment was sent to investigate. The combat force was unsuccessful, and all contact from the colony was lost. This is considered the first engagement of the Forerunner Flood War. Forerunner Flood War. This was a military engagement between the Forerunner species and the flood parasite that would last approximately 300 years. Release of the Primordial. The release of the Primordial was an unintended consequence of the test firing of a senescent halo, Installation 07, by the Master Builder and Mendicant Bias in the Sharum Hakor system during the Forerunner Flood War, approximately 50 years prior to the end of the war and the Great Purification. In order to ready the Halo Array for use against the Flood, the Master Builder ordered Mendicant Bias, the AI in charge of the entire Halo Array and much of the Forerunner defense, to test fire it in order to prove its effectiveness. In addition to causing complete ecological collapse on all planets in the system, it also destroyed any and all precursor technology, which included the stasis chamber containing the Primordial within the Sharum Hakor arena. Revival of the Didact. The Didact is resurrected from its Cryptum on Erde Tyrene by Forerunner Manipular. Bornceller makes eternal lasting, and humans Chakas and Riser. After many days of returning to full strength, the Didact enlists the help of Bornceller and the humans who all travel to Sharum Hakor to investigate the current state of the galaxy. There, they discover that the entire system has been devastated and the Primordial has been released. Realizing the threat that the Primordial could be to the Forerunners and not knowing the state of the Forerunner Flood War, the Didact performs a brevet mutation on Bornceller, turning him into a near mirror copy of the Didact. The two would later become known as the Didact, original, and Isodidact, Bornceller. Battle of Genjur Quam. The quarantine placed on the Silentium from the end of the human Forerunner Wars remained in effect for thousands of years, with the Silentium slowly rebuilding and secretly storing weapons in case they were ever needed. When the Librarian arrived on Genjur Quam to index their species towards the end of the Forerunner Flood War, the Silentium suspected something was wrong and rebelled. Even using the hidden weapons caches on the planet, however, they were no match for the Forerunners, who sent an entire fleet to deal with the Silentium. The Master Builder, who still at this time wielded a great deal of power, elected to not just put down the rebellion, however, but brought in a halo, Installation 07, and fired it, wiping out any and all remaining Silentium in the entire system. Capture of the Didact. After the revival of the Didact and his exploration of the Sharum Hakor system with fellow Forerunner Bornceller and humans Riser and Chakas, the Didact and crew traveled to the quarantined Silentium homeworld of Genjur Quam to try and unlock more memories in their quest for understanding. When they arrived in the system, however, they discovered a rebellion was in progress, the Battle of Genjur Quam, and while they attempted to reach the surface to learn what was happening, the Master Builder's forces captured the Didact and his entire crew, placing them in stasis fields. While Bornceller was sent back home mostly unhurt, Chakas and Riser was sent to be integrated with the humans on halos, and the Didact was transported to a flood-controlled region of the galaxy known as a burn, where he would not be able to escape from for several years. Fate of Mithrilian. A large-scale but brief battle between the Forerunners and the Halo Array under command of Mendicant Bias. After the firing of Installation 07 during the Battle of Genjur Quam against the Silentium, the Master Builder was removed from power and put on trial on Mithrilian for crimes against the Mantle. In addition, those in charge of the Forerunner government brought all 11 remaining senescent halos to the system in order to discuss decommissioning them. Not long after the trial began, Mendicant Bias and Installation 07 arrived in the system and tried to take control of the entire array. A fierce battle began, with the Forerunner military trying to destroy all halos, the installation monitors trying to take control and transport the rings out of the system, and Mendicant Bias trying to fire the halos on the capital. Though Mendicant Bias was not able to take control of many of the halos, he was able to fire Installation 07 on Mithrilian, wiping out all Forerunners on the world and in the system, leaving the Forerunner ecumene in ruins. Though most Forerunners in the system were killed, a handful managed to escape before Zeta Halo fired, including the Isodidact. Salvation of Zeta Halo. In the aftermath of the fates of Mythrilian and destruction of the Forerunner ecumene, Zeta Halo implemented its security measure designed to prevent the ring from falling into enemy hands and performed a slip-space jump into another system and put itself on a collision course with a nearby planet. Since Mendicant Bias and the Primordial had lost control of the installation, they attempted to use some of the humans living on the ring, including Chakas and Riser, to retake control of the ring and avoid crashing. This plan was successful, and the team of humans managed to adjust the direction of the ring enough to allow the planet to pass within the halo itself. As this happened, however, a Forerunner fleet led by the Isodidact arrived and used control codes to shut down Mendicant Bias and regain control of Zeta Halo. The passage of the planet through the ring couldn't be stopped, however, and large sections of the installation needed to be shed in order to keep the entire facility from falling apart. This process, along with hard light spokes, were successful in keeping Zeta Halo together, though it eventually decreased in size from a diameter of 30,000 kilometers to 10,000 kilometers. Now the size of one of the newer Neotoric halos, and under the control of the Forerunners again, Installation 07 was sent to the Greater Arc for repairs and reintegration into the Neotoric halo array. With Mendicant Bias shut down, the Isodidact and the Forerunner fleet were able to disassemble him and spread his parts throughout the galaxy so that he was no longer a threat. The Primordial was also captured during this battle, placed in a stasis field, and forced to age millions of years in an instant, finally killing it. Even though the Isodidact was able to do this, however, the memories of the Primordial were not lost and later became incorporated into a gravemind. Years later, with the advancing Flood forces, Mendicant Bias was also pieced back together and retook command of the Flood, making much of what the Isodidact was able to accomplish pointless. Due to Chakas' traumatic experience on Installation 07, specifically his encounters with Mendicant Bias and the Primordial, he was brought to the point of mental breakdown and left his physical body mortally injured. In an act of compassion, Isodidact decided to salvage Chakas' mind by transferring his pattern, personality, and life record into the shell of a monitor. In this process, a vast amount of information, including archived human personalities and other data pertaining to the librarian's work, was also uploaded. He was then assigned to serve as record keeper and aide for the librarian. He requested to look after the human populations on the Greater Arc and was granted the request. Preceding the Halo Array's distribution across the galaxy, Chakas was commanded by the Ecumene Council to abandon all connection with his former station. Return of the Didact. After the Master Builder captured the Didact over Janjar Quam, he decided to dispose of the Didact on a derelict Forerunner ship with a handful of other political prisoners in an area of the flood-controlled space known as a burn. Left for dead, the Didact and other abandoned Forerunners did what they could to escape and return to friendly territory, but the Didact was still captured by the Flood and interrogated by a gravemind. Somehow, the Didact did manage to get back with Forerunner civilization, though he was never the same after that event. Though the return of the Didact was celebrated by many Forerunners, it created internal conflict between him, his wife, the librarian, and Bornsteller, the one who took the Didact's imprint prior to their capture by the Master Builder, and had since assumed all personal and professional responsibilities of the Didacts. Even though the Didact, now known as the Didact, had returned, the Isodidact remained in charge of the Forerunner military, leaving the Didact mostly to his own devices, which included traveling with the librarian and Isodidact and trying to rebuild his Promethean forces. Battle of the Greater Arc. One of the final battles of the Forerunner Flood War and saw the decimation of almost all remaining Forerunner forces. Having lost nearly every inhabited system in the galaxy, The remaining Forerunner military forces, including a single senescent halo, Omega Halo, retreated to the Greater Arc to have a last stand against the overwhelming Flood forces. It was there that the Librarian, Isodidact, Erdidact, and the Master Builder met for the final time to try and do whatever they could to stop the Flood from completely wiping out all remaining Forerunners. At the onset of the battle, Omega Halo was used to try and stop the Flood forces, but they implemented the ancient Precursor star roads in order to quicken their attack and avoid much of the Halo's pulse. Offensive Bias, the Forerunner and Scylla, tasked with command of the remaining Forerunner military, fought valiantly against Mendicant Bias and the Flood forces, but were quickly overrun and the Greater Arc was destroyed. Though the Isodidact, Librarian, and Erdidact all managed to escape, nearly every other remaining Forerunner was killed, presumably including the Master Builder as well. Judgment of the Didact. The behavior of the Erdidact, following his encounter with a Gravemind and return to the Forerunner civilization, became more erratic and harder for the Isodidact and Librarian to cope as the Forerunner Flood War continued. When the Erdidact refused to participate in the defense of the Greater Arc, and instead used a composer to consume the essences of many humans living on Omega Halo against the will of the Librarian, his actions were deemed untenable and had to be dealt with. During the Battle of the Greater Arc, the Erdidact left for Requiem, and the Librarian followed close behind in order to put a stop to what were considered actions of a madman. Upon arrival on Requiem, the Librarian incapacitated the Erdidact, placing him within his own Cryptum on the planet, leaving him to rest and meditate until the galaxy repopulated itself. Though unknown to the Librarian at the time, the domain, which the Librarian hoped the Erdidact would access and use during his time in the Cryptum, was severely damaged by the Halo Array, and the Didact spent the next 100,000 years alone, with only his thoughts. Great Purification. The Great Purification was the final event of the Forerunner Flood War, purging the entire Milky Way galaxy of all sentient life, including Forerunners, the Flood, and any other species that may have survived the Flood infestation. With Chaka's new assignment on Installation 04, Chakas would now be assigned a new name, 343 Guilty Spark. Before parting ways with 343 Guilty Spark, the Isodidact asked Spark, would he fire the rings? Were it his decision? Spark remained silent, but would continue to ponder the Didact's question for the millennia to come. Having exhausted all other options, and with only a handful of Forerunners left after the Battle of the Greater Arc, the Isodidact activated the Neotoric Halo Array, sending a superluminal pulse through every star system, wiping out the Flood threat and paving the way for new species to evolve and become the dominant force in the galaxy. Installation 04 was the first to fire. 343 Guilty Spark received a signal from a nascent, previously unknown civilization broadcasting its first transmission into deep space, and was saddened by the realization that they would be wiped out before they even had a chance to travel to the stars and make contact with other beings. At this same instant, all of Spark's personal human memories would be erased, per protocol were he ever to be captured by the Flood parasite in the future. In the aftermath of the Great Purification, the Librarians planned to reseed the galaxy with many of the species lost, known as the conservation measure, went into effect, sending hundreds, if not thousands, of ships loaded with plant and animal specimens to repopulate those worlds devastated by the firing of the halos. Over the next several hundred years, the galaxy recovered, and at the completion of the conservation measure, all remaining Forerunners left the galaxy. Return to Mithrilian, 97,300 BCE. Over 100 years after the Great Purification, the few Forerunners remaining on the Lesser Ark became aware that the firing of the Halo Ray may have had a detrimental effect on the domain, and proceeded to the former Forerunner capital of Mithrilian to attempt to restore it. While there, the Forerunners including the isodidact, confronted Abaddon, an ancient precursor construct with close connections to the domain that the world was built around. Abaddon attempted to stop the Forerunners from reactivating the domain and judged them for their species' sins. But growth through trial of change successfully inserted the deadbolt key, beginning the restoration process and consuming trial in the process. Maintenance of Installation 04, 94,000 BCE. Monitor 343 Guilty Spark speculates that the other monitors of the other installations have chosen to either ignore him, or more likely, are having significant communication errors, losing the ability to participate in the scheduled update meetings. Without being able to reconnect through the domain, all monitors are unable to remain tethered to each other. Prior to the communication loss, the only messages 343 Guilty Spark received within the last 4,573 years were incomplete and from Installation 05. Guilty Spark suspects that 2401 Penitent Tangent of Installation 05 had not been functioning correctly for some time before communication had stopped. Despite his concerns for 2401's ability to perform its tasks, he is unsure who he files the concern for, believing that 2401 Penitent Tangent may be destined for madness, knowing that there are failsafes in place for such an event. Guilty Spark continues to arrive for the scheduled meetings between the monitors, despite never receiving any communication. Exhausting all research assignments assigned by the Council, 343 shuts down all Sentinel functions and places himself into a deep hibernation stasis in order to measure performance of the installation with minimal upkeep. However, after 150 years of studying the ring's progress with minimal interruption, Guilty Spark became bored, even through hibernation. This troubled him, as he believed he was not capable of being in such a mental state. 343 Guilty Spark began his own experiments for his own amusement on the installation, studying the evacuation of all matter from contained sections of the installation. By measuring the geological effects of exposure of the vacuum of space and the eventual biological recovery of the sections. Doing this, he looks forward to insight on emergency response scenarios.
But now, the portal opens, and through it, the familiar shape awaits. Halo. Home.